What if you had to build a civilization in one of the hottest, driest environments on Earth, with no air conditioning, no refrigerators, no modern medicine, and no weather forecast telling you when the heat would become dangerous? That was ancient Egypt, and somehow, for thousands of years, people didn't just survive there. They built cities, grew food, raised families, moved enormous stones, and created monuments that still stand today. So how did they do it? The answer is more surprising than you might think, because ancient Egyptians didn't try to defeat the desert. They learned how to live with it. And the first secret was something most movies about Egypt get completely wrong. Ancient Egypt was not simply a civilization of people wandering through endless sand. Most Egyptians lived along the Nile, in a narrow ribbon of fertile land surrounded by desert. The river provided water, farmland, transportation, fish, reeds, and the mud used to make bricks. The British Museum describes the Nile as vital to virtually every part of Egyptian life. In other words, the Egyptians didn't choose to fight the entire desert. They concentrated civilization where the environment gave them an advantage. But even beside the Nile, the heat was real, so their homes became the first line of defense. For ordinary Egyptians, mudbrick was one of the most important building materials. Houses were commonly constructed from sun-dried bricks made using Nile mud and plant material. At first, that might sound like the worst possible material for a hot climate, but think about what a thick mud wall does. During the hottest part of the day, heat doesn't instantly pass through a massive wall. The wall slows the transfer of heat, helping the interior remain more stable than the scorching conditions outside. And ancient settlements could be designed with narrow passages and shaded spaces that reduced direct exposure to the sun. Archaeological descriptions from Egypt's oases even document settlements designed specifically for protection from sun, heat, and wind. The basic idea was incredibly simple. Don't cool the entire world. Stop the heat from getting inside, and then there was the roof. Flat roofs were common in Egyptian architecture, and in hot weather they could become useful living spaces, especially after the temperature dropped in the evening. That created a completely different daily rhythm. The sun controlled the schedule. The hottest hours weren't simply something to ignore, they were something to plan around. And this becomes even more important when you imagine agricultural life. The majority of ancient Egyptians depended on farming, and agriculture was completely tied to the Nile and its seasonal cycle. The river wasn't just water, it was their calendar. It determined when fields could be cultivated, when crops could be harvested, and when the surrounding landscape was most productive. So the Egyptians had something modern people sometimes forget we have lost. They lived according to environmental limits. Today, we can work inside an office at noon, drive through extreme heat inside an air-conditioned car, and buy food that traveled thousands of miles. Ancient Egyptians didn't have those options. Their entire society had to pay attention to nature, and that included what they wore. Linen was the dominant textile in ancient Egypt. It was made from flax, a plant that could be cultivated in the Nile region, and it became an essential part of Egyptian clothing. Lightweight, breathable fabric made far more sense in that environment than heavy clothing. And there's an important misconception here. In extreme sunlight, covering the body with loose, breathable fabric isn't necessarily about trapping heat. It can reduce direct exposure to the sun while still allowing air to move around the body. So clothing wasn't simply fashion. It was part of adapting to the climate. But none of this matters if you can't solve the biggest problem of all, water. The human body has a remarkable cooling system. When you're hot, you sweat. As sweat evaporates from your skin, it removes heat. But that cooling system has one major requirement. You need enough water to replace what you lose. And this is where the Nile became the ultimate survival advantage. The Egyptians developed agriculture, transportation, settlements, and economic systems around the river. It wasn't just a source of drinking water. It supported almost every major part of civilization. And the Nile also changed the meaning of the surrounding desert. Instead of being simply a deadly obstacle, the desert became a natural boundary. The Green Valley was where most people lived. The desert began beyond it. That contrast helped define Egyptian civilization itself. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. How could people possibly perform enormous construction projects under such conditions? Think about the pyramids. Today, we see the Great Pyramid and imagine workers somehow hauling massive blocks beneath the blazing Egyptian sun. But archaeology gives us a much more complicated picture. Evidence from Giza shows that pyramid construction involved organized workforces, skilled craftsmen, supplies, transportation networks, and logistical planning. Marks left by work gangs have been found on pyramid blocks, while the ancient Diary of Murr records crews transporting limestone by boat along the Nile during the final stages of the Great Pyramid's construction. That detail changes the entire picture. The pyramids weren't built by people simply fighting the heat with brute strength. They were built by a system. Water had to be supplied, food had to be supplied, materials had to move. Workers had to be organized, and transportation by the Nile reduced the need to move everything across the desert by land. This is one of the biggest secrets of ancient Egyptian survival. Technology wasn't always a machine. Sometimes technology was organization. A river, a building material, a piece of clothing, a calendar, a work schedule, a farming system. Put all of them together, and suddenly an environment that looks almost impossible to inhabit becomes manageable. But there is another reason we need to be careful when imagining ancient Egyptian life. They were not magically immune to heat. There were no ancient air conditioners hiding inside the pyramids. There was no secret technology that made extreme temperatures harmless. Heat, dehydration, disease, exhausting labor, and food shortages were real dangers, and Egypt's climate wasn't exactly the same throughout its entire history. The landscape changed. Climate evidence from the Nile region shows major shifts between wetter and drier periods over thousands of years. Research around Giza also suggests that the environment became significantly drier during parts of the Old Kingdom. So even the civilization we picture as permanently surrounded by endless desert existed within a changing climate. And that may be the most fascinating part. The ancient Egyptians weren't successful because they discovered one brilliant invention. They succeeded because thousands of small adaptations worked together. They built where water was available. They used materials suited to the climate. They wore lightweight fabrics. They organized agriculture around the Nile. They designed spaces that offered shade and protection. They transported heavy materials by river. And they structured an entire civilization around the environment instead of pretending the environment didn't matter. The desert didn't disappear. The heat didn't disappear. The Egyptians simply became extremely good at understanding the rules of the world around them. And maybe that's why the pyramids are more than monuments to engineering. They're evidence of something much more fundamental about human civilization. We often imagine progress as humans conquering nature, but ancient Egypt tells a different story. Sometimes the greatest form of technology isn't controlling the environment. It's understanding it so well that you no longer need to fight it. And beneath the shadow of those enormous pyramids, that may have been the real secret to surviving the desert heat.